So what about painting your board gaming miniatures? How we approach this vlog really depends on kind of where you are in the hobby. There is a lot of crossover. You might be a wargamer like myself that is capable of painting miniatures or enjoys painting miniatures, so it's a natural extension to paint your board gaming miniatures. You might be a new enthusiast that loves board games. You're looking at some amazing pieces in your collection, and you're saying, I think maybe I want to paint these pieces. You could be a Dungeons and Dragons player, and certainly the pre-paints across various lines look fantastic. But from that perspective, it could be, hey, I paint my D&D miniatures. I'm going to paint my board gaming miniatures. So what are the thoughts from that perspective? What I find interesting, if you've been following my channel, you know my three passions are wargaming, absolutely. Role-playing games, absolutely. Board games, absolutely. And some of these are very straightforward, but if we look across the spectrum of my vlogs, there is a lot of crossover. I mean, going back to the beginning of time, recently we were talking about tanks and Battletech, and it's interesting to see where things go. Battletech is a tabletop futuristic sci-fi miniature game. Then we kind of dip into Ogre. Ogre was a board game that I played back a long time ago. Essentially, it's a super cybernetic AI tank versus lots of infantry and tanks. One person's the tank, one person's the other units, or the tank pilots itself. And we were exploring that perspective. Ogre, like many early war games, one of my first war games that I played, I still have it. I love it. So many memories. Web and Starship. It's essentially three alien races battling it out with different abilities. I was going to compare it to TI Light, but that's not really fair because TI is a fantastic game and Web and Starship is a fantastic game. But I remember playing Web and Starship because it was really interesting. It was hex-based. There were counters. The artwork was like kind of hex-based artwork games. We never got our reprint, right? But from that perspective, this idea of board games used to be just that, board games with maybe a token and some cards. Now they've evolved miniatures. I look at Nemesis, and I just have core Nemesis. I didn't even jump into the Kickstarter or the expansions. And I look at Nemesis, and I'm like, these pieces are amazing. I've painted them up. They pull double duty in my Tyranid army, my Warhammer 40K Tyranid army. So that's a miniature-based game. You see this with some of the other fantasy miniatures where players and enthusiasts are taking their board gaming miniatures and utilizing them in their role-playing games. So we've got massive, massive crossover. It's only natural to think about painting them. Now, I'm all about the narrative. I want to sit down with you. We're taking time out of life, school, responsibility, work. That paper you should be writing that you're going to blame on me because I'm like, don't write your paper. Let's go play some Axis and Allies, right? But from that perspective, sitting down, we're going to have an experience together. We're going to roll some dice. We're going to have a lot of fun. I want that experience to be as premium as possible. So I want to play a game that we're all going to enjoy together. And I'm open to trying any type of new game. If you're passionate about something, you're excited about a title, bring it over and let's play it. But in that quest, there are certain games that when they're painted, they take things to a new level. So I want to encourage you to consider painting your games. And we're just going to look at a brief suggestion because certainly my channel is not about painting, and there's a lot of amazing, amazing channels to paint. Zombicide Invader, Zombicide Black Plague. I rank, this is kind of having an obsessive and compulsive personality that's also a completionist. I log every game that I play. Time in, time out, date, win-loss, expansions, and notes. It's pretty crazy. So from that perspective, Zombicide Black Plague is one of my most played games for a variety of reasons. It's easy to understand. You walk in, you walk up to it, and you're like, okay, zombies and magic and rolling dice. It's beer and pretzels. It plays really well. It works for what it does. It's a lot of fun. So this is a game that I play solo a lot. This is a game that if it's a go-to to the club or with a friend's house, whether we're scheduled to play it or just I'm going to set it up if people want to play it, it's up there with plays. Top 3 are Runebound. Runebound's number one. Always playing Runebound all the time. Number two is Pathfinder Adventure card game. Although that's not really that fair because that, even solo, that takes a while to play. But we're logging that. Then we've got Zombicide Black Plague. And we've got Zombicide Invader. So other games like TI and Kingdom Death Monster, they would be up there. Absolutely. But just they only make it to the table a couple of times a year due to the mechanics and the setup. But Black Plague, in playing it, I wanted to up that experience. So my first thought, let's paint these miniatures. Let's paint up all the miniatures. It was quite a feat. I really didn't know what I was getting myself into. You look at that pile of plastic and you're like, okay, we're gonna do it. It took a while, but a fully painted game looks amazing. And then I said to myself, well, let's just have some random furniture. I had some stuff left over from Dungeon Saga. I had some other D&D furniture. I painted it up, doors, tables, barrels, treasure chests, stuff like that, just to randomly put in a room. So when we open a room, I'll just populate it with some furniture. It has no effect on gameplay, but it's kind of neat because it shows where you are and it kind of brings it to that dimension, where you are, where you're going. The experience, the game is still fantastic, unpainted. Absolutely. Zombicide Invader is unpainted. It's on my to-do list to paint, but we're playing it all the time. I really don't want to have it out of commission. But from that perspective, it does really upgrade your game. So I would encourage you to consider painting your miniatures. Now, the two options that I really want to kind of just mention, and then we'll kind of finish from that, because even though this isn't a paint video, there are two very, very interesting things that I learned over the years of painting miniatures. The first is to have some test type miniatures. So when I was painting my Warhammer 40K stuff, it's a sci-fi miniature game. Early on, painting my Space Marines, I got a couple of used Space Marines, missing some pieces, a little bit broken up, but unpainted. I painted those up first. I tested it on those. I tried to see the color palette, what it looked like. So if you have some fear of like, wow, jumping into Zombicide Black Plague, let's just say you're staring at hundreds of zombies and abominations, and you're looking and saying, I can't even decide where to begin, get a couple of figures that are similar to it. Practice, learn, check the paint palette, check the colors, see how you like it, maybe try an experimental basing technique. You have zero pressure of messing up or redoing it or anything, and then you jump in. The second aspect that I found really helpful, of course, YouTube and a lot of other resources. If it's possible, or you are part of a gaming club, or there's a gaming store, if there are people that play miniature-based war games like Warhammer 40,000, got to be careful. And I say be careful out of love, because you go to them for some help. The 40K community is amazing. They're going to be like, check this game out. Play some Space Marines. And then next thing you know, you're like just sucked into that narrative. But I suggest that if you're not a part of that community, or maybe even a Dungeons & Dragons type community that plays with miniatures, there are a lot of enthusiasts and players that do paint their own stuff, either from the perspective of Warhammer 40,000, where you have to paint your miniatures, or D&D, where players like to paint their miniatures. Sometimes there'll be a paint night. Sometimes you can meet other players, and they're always working on their army. There's many times over the summer where I'll just have some friends over. We sit in the backyard, out on the patio, put on the barbecue, and we just spend the day painting and just hanging out and talking. And that was always very helpful, because if I was having trouble with something, or it was an effect that I'm really not that good at, I could get some help. I could get some real feedback. I mean, yes, absolutely, tutorials on YouTube and videos are great, but having that one-to-one feedback, you'll find the miniature community is very well plugged in and a great group of people. So there's that possibility where if you say, hey, I'm looking to paint some miniatures, what do you think? Do you have some ideas? That can also really help with that intimidation of, I want to paint my stuff, but it's a lot, and I don't want to make any mistakes, or I don't want to mess things up, because then what do I do about the board game? It's where do I even start? All those questions, all those natural questions. Those are two ways that will help you ease into that. So I would say consider it. I don't think it's mandatory to have your miniatures painted, but it does definitely up that experience.